Since the famous book and film Manufacturing Consent, Noam Chomsky has stirred up debate about the role of propaganda in the corporate democratic system. In May 2007, Chomsky spoke again at a conference organized by the University of Windsor. The event was 20 Years of Propaganda, and the speech was The Poison Chalice, the Media, and the Use of Force. Chomsky describes how the media hides war crimes when we commit them, and compares American behavior to the standards of the Nuremberg war crimes trials of top Nazi leaders. Here is Noam Chomsky.
The words of the title, which are perhaps familiar, are borrowed from U.S. Justice Robert Jackson. He was the chief of counsel for the prosecution at the Nuremberg Tribunal, and he was these are drawn from his address to the tribunal on the principle of universality. That is the foundation of any moral code that can be taken seriously. It's the principle that we apply to ourselves, the same standards that we apply to others, if not more stringent ones. Justice Jackson admonished the tribunal that this elementary principle must be their guide, or else its proceedings will be nothing but legal farce, an act of vengeance, victor's justice. So, to quote Jackson's memorable words, if certain acts of violation of treaties are crimes, they are crimes whether the United States does them or whether Germany does them. And we are not prepared to lay down a rule of criminal conduct against others, which we would not be willing to have invoked against us. We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. The judgments of Nuremberg were incorporated into contemporary international law as founding principles, and although the tribunal was seriously and admittedly flawed, it's regularly invoked as the precedent and the standard for subsequent tribunals up until today, which are presented as high-minded efforts to approach the standards of Nuremberg, invariably falling short. One fundamental reason for their failure and their profoundly immoral character is that the principle of universality is universal in only one crucial respect. It's universally rejected with scarcely any departure. Worse, the rejection is scarcely, if ever, even noticed. So deeply ingrained is the doctrine that we are immune to fundamental moral and legal principles. The poisoned chalice has never approached the lips of the powerful, no matter crimes. And one of the tasks of the media is to repeat that result. Worse still, this is considered right and just, or more accurately, is routinely concealed in a display of self-praise, tainted only by the recognition of failure and incompetence, which is reminiscent of concerns of the Nazi high command after Hitler made the foolish error of opening a two-front war. And that is regrettably all too accurate a portrayal of the stance of the intellectual culture, media in particular, with regard to the blood that's on our hands from Nuremberg to the present day. Actually, that ugly outcome was foreseen by the more acute participants in the Nuremberg proceedings, and notably Telford Taylor, who was Jackson's chief counsel for war crimes. The central crime addressed by the Nuremberg Tribunal, of course, was the crime of launching aggressive war. Quoting Taylor before the trials, he said, "This phase of the case is based on the assumption that it is or will be declared a punishable offense to plan and launch And then he interpolated, and lose, question mark, an aggressive war. His question, and lose, was quickly proven to be all too appropriate. So the crime is to lose an aggressive war. In retrospect, Taylor described Justice Jackson's instructions to the tribunal as beautiful words, but did the results match the aspiration? It's a rhetorical question, as he intended. The results could not have undermined the aspiration with more force and cruelty. Aggression in the tribunal's judgment, quoted, is the supreme international crime, differing from others only in that it encompasses all of the evil that follows. All means all. So in Iraq, the crime of aggression encompasses the savage destruction of Fallujah, sectarian violence, death squads, the desperate flight of 2 million people, displacement of 2 million others, and the rest of the horrors of the past few years that are too familiar to review, with the aggressors absolved from blame, except in marginal respects, in keeping with the conventional refusal to sip from the poisoned chalice. There was no ambiguity in the definition of the supreme international crime. In Justice Jackson's opening statement to the tribunal, he defined an aggressor as a state that is the first to commit such actions as invasion of its armed forces with or without a declaration of war of the territory of another state. Very clear. There's actually more to which I'll return, but this provision holds unambiguously for the U.S.-British invasion of Iraq, which is the leading issue on the international agenda today, and by far the greatest concern of Americans, according to regular polls. Well, there is vigorous debate about Iraq, but it's within strict limits, which are familiar, for example, from the debate on Vietnam for many years. Iraq is often compared to Vietnam. A comparison that is accurate in one respect only, namely how the war is perceived by the aggressors. Almost every other respect is radically different. Particularly instructive, as always, is the interpretation of the doves at the extreme critical end of the admissible spectrum. These are the guardians of permissible thought. In both cases, Vietnam and Iraq, the doves condemn the war as a quagmire, too costly to us. To quote one representative example from Vietnam, the way out at the extreme of critical commentary. At the war's end, New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis explained that U.S. intervention began with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969, most people realized that it was a disastrous mistake, that the U.S. could not impose a solution except at a price too costly to itself. 1969 was a year after corporate America had called for the enterprise to be liquidated, the U.S. having attained its basic goals. 1969 was 2 years after the highly respected military historian and Vietnam specialist Bernard Fall warned that Vietnam as a cultural and historic entity is threatened with extinction, while in the South, which is always the main target of U.S. aggression in Vietnam, in the South, the countryside literally dies under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed on an area this size. But at the liberal, dovish end of the spectrum, it was becoming too costly to us. That's as far as you could go. But not the population, however, U.S. population. By 1969, 70% of the U.S. population regarded the war, quoting, as not a mistake, but fundamentally wrong and immoral. Those figures have remained pretty constant to the present. pretty remarkable because everyone reaches that conclusion on their own. The words are unpronounceable in the mainstream. Well, to mention one other case, preeminent liberal American historian and Kennedy advisor Arthur Schlesinger at first supported the Kennedy-Johnson aggression, adopting the virtually universal stance. There was no objection to that. But 4 years after Kennedy launched the direct aggression, Schlesinger was having second thoughts, and he wrote, "We all pray that the Hawks will be right, and that sending more troops will bring us victory. And if the surge of that day works, we may all be praising the wisdom and statesmanship of the American government in winning victory in a tragic country gutted and devastated by bombs, a land of ruin and wreck." But he doubted that it would work, so he was at the dovish extreme. And he therefore added, "No thoughtful American can withhold sympathy as President Johnson ponders the gloomy choices that lie ahead." That is, sympathy for the president, but not his victims. The translation to the present moment is perfectly straightforward with a few changes of names. It's what you read today in the papers. Well, it's kind of significant that Schlesinger's position on the Iraq War was radically different. As the bombing of Iraq began, March 2003, he recalled the words of President Roosevelt after Pearl Harbor, and he wrote that the bombing of Baghdad, too, is a date which will live in infamy. Roosevelt's famous words at Pearl Harbor. The bombing is a date that will live in infamy as the U.S. embraces the policies of Imperial Japan. That was a lone voice in the mainstream. Schlesinger died a few months ago, and he was greatly honored, but not for this statement, which has been effectively dispatched to the memory hole. The prevailing attitudes about Iraq, the Iraq aggression, are much as in the case of Vietnam, benign and intense by definition, but becoming too costly to us as a result of the incompetence and the errors of the political leadership. Justice Jackson's principle of universality is not even a faded presence. Also gone from history and media coverage is Washington's torture of the Iraqi people in earlier years, from the CIA-sponsored coup of 1963, certainly backed, probably initiated by the CIA. That's the coup that laid the basis for the rule of Saddam Hussein, a rule which Washington strongly supported from virtually its outset. As you all know, Saddam was hanged for crimes that he committed in 1982, crimes that were minor by his standards, only 150 people killed. With impressive discipline, the media and commentators failed to notice that 1982 was an important year in U.S.-Iraq relations. It was in 1982 that President Reagan removed Iraq from the list of states supporting terrorism so that the U.S. could begin to provide Saddam with substantial aid, including means to develop weapons of mass destruction. To firm up the deal, Reagan sent his special emissary to Baghdad named Donald Rumsfeld. Along with others, the U.S. and U.S.-British support for Saddam continued without a break, right through his most horrendous crimes, and long after the end of the war with Iran. In 1989, the Bush administration, first Bush administration, invited 3 Iraqi scientists to attend a detonation conference in Oregon, where they learned from experts all over the world how shockwaves detonate nuclear weapons. In short, they were being trained in advanced means to develop nuclear weapons. In December 1989, Bush was sending materials that the Iraq regime could use for nuclear, missile, and chemical purposes. Actually, I'm quoting from congressional records, not from the press, which has kept this far removed from sight for 15 years now. In April 1990, Bush sent a high-level senatorial delegation to Iraq, led by Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole, later Republican presidential candidate. Their mission was to bring President Bush's greetings to his friend Saddam and to assure him of U.S. support. Well, 4 months after the Bush mission, Saddam invaded Kuwait, either disobeying or misunderstanding orders. That's a real crime. That shifted him from the category of honored friend to embodiment of evil. The invasion of Kuwait was indeed a crime, though not by Saddam standards, or for that matter by U.S. standards. A few months earlier, the United States invaded Panama, vetoing a couple of Security Council resolutions and killing probably thousands of mostly poor people. According to the victims, more than died in Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, though we don't know the details, because it's a firm principle of international affairs and moral culture that the victors do not permit investigation of their own crimes, so we only have the victims' reports. Well, those were the early days of U.S. torture of Iraqis, which continued without a break. At the time of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, American public opinion was strongly in favor of a diplomatic solution, a solution which would combine Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait with international negotiations to settle the regional crisis. That's actually pretty much what Saddam had proposed, though the media politely withheld the information, except for one newspaper, Newsday, a suburban newspaper here in New York on Long Island. It's kind of an interesting fact that right throughout the build-up to the war, officials in Washington were leaking information to Newsday, which it published. The U.S.-British attack devastated Iraqi civilian society, which it was aimed at, and it was followed by a return of support for Saddam Hussein, as he then turned to the slaughter of the Shiites to suppress an uprising that probably would have overthrown him had he not been effectively authorized by Washington to crush him. And the reasons were not suppressed, they were frankly acknowledged. New York Times Mideast correspondent Alan Cowell, still with the Mideast correspondent, he explained that there is a strikingly unanimous view among the United States and its allies, Britain and Saudi Arabia, that Saddam offered the West and the region a better hope for his country's stability than did those who have suffered his repression. So we therefore unhappily have to support Saddam's crushing of the rebellion. I'll return to the interesting concept stability, which is regularly invoked today too. Well, at that point, the task of torturing Iraqis was turned over to Bill Clinton. That's the sanctions regime, which was so visibly murderous that by 1996 it was felt necessary to introduce a humanitarian modification. That's the Oil for Food program, which magnanimously permitted Iraq to use a fraction of its own resources to save its own population from total destruction, though in sharply limited ways, carefully controlled by the United States and Britain. The first director of the program, a distinguished international diplomat, Amos Halliday, Irish, he resigned in protest after 2 years, condemning the program as genocidal. Notice that's the humanitarian program. He condemned it genocidal and resigned. He was replaced by another highly respected international diplomat, Hans von Sponeck, German. He also resigned after a couple of years, charging that the Clinton-Blair administration of the sanctions violated the Genocide Convention. Their well-documented charges are scrupulously ignored by those who posture grandly about genocide when they depict crimes of some official enemy, not on that scale. Halliday and von Sponeck were iced out of the U.S. media during the build-up to the 2003 invasion, although, or perhaps because, they knew more about Iraq than any other Westerners. Or perhaps it's because the media agreed with the official Clinton State Department position when it blocked von Sponeck's efforts to bring the grisly record to the Security Council. Their phrase was, "This man in Baghdad is paid to work, not to talk." And that was Clinton's State Department. So he can't inform the Security Council. Well, he does talk, however. And in free societies like ours, we're lucky to be able to read von Sponeck's detailed and devastating account of the effect of the genocidal sanctions and the Clinton-Blair role in ensuring their brutality. His book, called A Different Kind of War, appeared last year. It's one of those books that is too important to be reviewed or mentioned. A recent database search a couple days ago found not a single mention of it in the United States, and in England, a single review in the Morning Star. Exactly mainstream. Robert Fisk also brought it up in the Irish press. Apparently that's the only English language mention. It's easy, quite easy, however, to find ample praise for Tony Blair's profound moral convictions as he stepped down from office a few days ago. I'm sure you've read many of these accolades. The crimes I mentioned are only a small part of the ugly story. For Clinton, even more so. Well, we can find out something about the effects of the Clinton-Blair sanctions, at least obliquely, if you read closely. So a couple of weeks ago, the media did report that Iraq has suffered the worst increase in child mortality of any country on record. If you look at the small print, you'll notice that is since 1990. That is, as a result of the sanctions regime in the war. And for the liberal hawks, a retrospective justification for the war, after the failure to find weapons of mass destruction, is that at least it rid the country of a brutal regime. That has the merit of being half true. It rid the country of two brutal regimes, Saddam Hussein's and the sanctions regime, which apparently killed far more Iraqis than Saddam, but only one of them is mentionable. Also unmentionable is the belief expressed by Halliday and von Sponeck that if Clinton and Blair had permitted Iraqi society to revive, Iraqis themselves might have dealt properly with Saddam's tyranny, and probably sending him to the same fate as a series of other vicious tyrants, many quite comparable to him, supported by the United States and Britain to the last days of their bloody rule. Ceausescu, Suharto, Marcos, Duvalier, long rogues gallery of others, to which new names are added regularly. None of this arousing any thoughts about our innate benign intentions to do good. Well, the outcome in Iraq, as you certainly know, is an unmitigated disaster. It's not surprising that last year, according to State Department polls, 2/3 of people in Baghdad wanted the United States to leave immediately. Large majorities elsewhere wanted the United States to withdraw within a year, which would mean within the next few months. and a vast majority felt that the presence of U.S. forces increases the level of violence. 60% regarded U.S. forces as legitimate targets of attack. These figures include Kurds, and they're much higher in the Arab areas where the troops are actually deployed. These figures have been rising steadily for some time and are presumably higher by now. Well, the U.S. public largely agrees. It, by a large majority, favors a firm timetable for withdrawal. The government reaction is escalation, the surge. The Democratic majority has proposed alternatives, but they're pretty pallid. Even the one that was vetoed was a useful analysis by General Kevin Ryan, who's now at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He suggests that the Democratic proposal should not be called withdrawal, but rather remissioning. The reason is that when you look at them closely, there's a national security exemption, meaning, as Bush says, this national security is at stake, do what you like. There's an exemption for combating international terrorism. It's also an open door. Troops are going to stay for training and for facilities and force protection. There's a tacit premise which underlies all public discussion about Iraq across the spectrum and other places too. The premise is we own the world. That's unmentionable, unnoticed. And on that assumption, you don't collapse in ridicule when you on any other assumption. Actually, that illustrates rather neatly a crucial difference between propaganda systems in totalitarian states and in democratic societies. In a totalitarian state, the party line is usually announced clearly and explicitly, and you better repeat it and say it when you're asked, or you get sent to the gulag or the torture chamber or something. You don't have to believe it. You just have to repeat it. That's a totalitarian system. In democratic societies, that doesn't work. The state has lost the capacity to control the population by violence. So therefore, the propaganda line somehow has to be believed or internalized. So what you do in a democratic society is you never articulate the party line. You never see an editorial saying, we own the world, so therefore we're not foreign anywhere. That would be a bad mistake. It's like Stalin. What you do is just presuppose it. You presuppose the party line, never say it, and then you encourage a vigorous debate within the framework established by the party line. So that gives the impression that the society is free and open, and it also helps instill the party line, because you can't even carry out the debate unless you accept it, like foreign forces. So it just becomes like the air you breathe, and you accept it. It's the way the world is. That's democratic propaganda. Plenty of illustrations. Just take one more, and take the surge. As soon as George Bush announced the surge in opposition to public opinion in the U.S. and, of course, Iraq, you could predict at once that it's going to be accompanied by charges of Iranian interference, which it was. So immediately we have charges of Iran interfering in Iraq. And then there comes a debate, vigorous debate. The hawks say, that Iran's interfering, let's blast it. The doves say, well, really not sure, maybe those roadside bombs, you didn't read the serial numbers correctly, maybe it's just the Revolutionary Guard, it's not the government. And you have a debate about that. The debate is totally senseless, except on the assumption that we own the world. You could not have a debate in, say, 1943 in Germany about whether the Allies were interfering in occupied Europe, say in Vichy France. I mean, maybe in Nazi Germany you could have a debate, but certainly not anywhere else. People collapse in ridicule. It was under military occupation. How can anybody be interfering? But we live in a democratic society, so therefore you can carry out the sort of effective propaganda which allows this debate to go on without ridicule. That's a tribute to our capacity to be controlled by government media propaganda. Universally, just about try to find some comment about all this. It's just taken for granted.
You are listening to the keynote speech by Noam Chomsky, delivered May 17th at the 20 Years of Propaganda Conference, organized by the University of Windsor, Canada. You're listening to Radio EcoShock every Friday at 1 o'clock on CFRO 102.7 FM, Co-op Radio in Vancouver.
Well, that's effective propaganda. And again, it's very much like Vietnam. So you go back to the Vietnam War, vigorous debate. It was not about the question of whether the United States has a right to invade and destroy a country. And of course we do. That's a given. So you don't debate it, you assert it. So it's not discussed in responsible circles. Rather, the questions that were discussed are the Russians interfering by providing North Vietnam with air defense? Is China interfering by rebuilding railroads, Chinese railroads that happen to pass through North Vietnamese territory that we're bombing? Are the Vietnamese intervening by supporting indigenous resistance in South Vietnam, which always was the main target of attack? That was the debate. Always. Actually, even in the anti-war movement, I'm sorry to say, it was kind of accepted. That's what you debate. At the extreme end, within the mainstream, you get Arthur Schlesinger, Anthony Lewis, and so on. Well, another illustration is this very interesting concept of stability that I mentioned. I mentioned one example. It's a standard usage. Bush #1 had to support Saddam's crushing of a rebellion that might have overthrown him in the interest of stability. In simple English, that means it's too dangerous to allow Iraqis to rule Iraq, and still is. Therefore, we have to impose stability, meaning subordination to U.S. rule. It's the tacit definition of the word. A couple of days ago, there's a front-page headline in the press saying, U.S.-Iran set to confer on Iraq stability. That is, on inducing Iran to contribute to U.S. rule over Iraq in a stable client state, which we rule by right since we own the world. Not going to question it. And nobody does. Well, given the technical usage, there's no contradiction when somebody writes, I'm quoting, that the United States had to destabilize a freely elected government in Chile because we were determined to seek stability. That's not a contradiction. Stability means subordination to U.S. rule, so therefore laying the basis for a murderous, vicious military coup, destabilizing it is the right thing to do in the interest of stability. That happens to be James Chase, liberal commentator, editor of Foreign Affairs in the New York Times. And it all makes sense, and therefore isn't questioned on the unspoken but critical assumption that the United States owns the world. You don't accept that assumption, you're just not part of civilized discourse. And again, never assert it. That would be a bad mistake, kind of like a totalitarian state. Just instill it by constant presupposition. We all agree, when it's somebody else, that invaders have no rights. They have no rights to make any decisions, whether to withdraw or not. They have responsibilities. Prime responsibility is to pay reparations for what they did. The second one is to hold the guilty accountable by the standards of Nuremberg. The third responsibility is to attend to the will of the victims, which then withdraw. In the U.S.-UK case, it would be the same if we were willing to accept the most elementary of moral principles, namely Jackson's principle of universality, which is, of course, unthinkable. If we could, the responsibility would be to pay massive reparations. But going back to Saddam's takeover, it includes the sanctions and the wars, hold those accountable who sip from the poisoned chalice, and attend to the will of the victims, which we know. Well, none of that's on the agenda, none of it's even discussable. And again, for the same reason, that we own the world, the principle of universality is canceled. To bring it up would elicit either vilification or hysteria or more often just incomprehensions, if you're talking Swahili or something like that. Also, not discussable are the reasons for the U.S.-UK invasion. Undiscussable. And for the unwillingness to withdraw without securing a dependable final state. It's a remarkable fact in free countries in the West that all of this is off the agenda, just as comparable questions were in the case of Vietnam and elsewhere. It's a topic for another talk. Let's go back to Nuremberg and aggression. I mentioned one provision of the definition of aggression at Nuremberg. There was another provision. This is Justice Jackson again. An aggressor is a state that commits such actions as provision of support to armed bands formed in the territory of another state, or refusal, notwithstanding the request of the invaded state, to take in its own territory all the measures in its power to deprive those bands of all assistance or protection. Okay? Uncontroversially and unambiguously, that applies, for example, to the Reaganite war against Nicaragua. So by the standards of Nuremberg, those responsible should have faced the death sentence. But that level of adherence to the principle of universality is far too unthinkable even to be mentioned without horror. So if you're not too horrified with mentioning. Recall that Nicaragua did bring charges against the United States in the World Court. However, the court would not consider the charge of aggression. In fact, the court dismissed most of Nicaragua's case, which was presented by a distinguished Harvard law professor, Abram Chase. The court dismissed it on the valid grounds that when the United States accepted World Court jurisdiction in 1946, the U.S. excluded itself from prosecution under multilateral treaties. That includes the UN Charter and the Charter of the Organization of American States. So it's impossible to bring a charge of aggression against the United States. The court, same happened when Yugoslavia charged NATO powers a couple of years ago for the bombing. The U.S. immediately removed itself from the case, and the court accepted it correctly. The reason was that Yugoslavia had brought up the Genocide Convention, and when the United States finally ratified the Genocide Convention 4 years after it was established, there was a special provision saying it's inapplicable to the United States. So therefore, by law, the United States is immune to charges of aggression and genocide. And in fact, it extends far further. All of this would be taught in junior high school in societies that valued their freedom. You might ask how many of you are familiar with it and draw the conclusion. Well, even on the narrow grounds that were permitted, the court had to restrict itself to customary international law and a particular bilateral U.S.-Nicaragua treaty. And even on those narrow grounds, the court did condemn the United States for unlawful use of force, which means international terrorism. It demanded that the crimes be terminated and that the U.S. pay substantial reparations. That was backed by 2 Security Council resolutions, which the United States vetoed, with Britain and France politely abstaining. The press reacted by dismissing the court as a hostile forum. New York Times editors, which is true, they condemned the U.S., so they're hostile forums. So you should pay attention to them. A couple of years earlier, the same court had been lauded for supporting Washington in a case against Iran. Congress reacted by providing substantial new funding for the war, a bipartisan vote. The U.S. command reacted by issuing orders to its mercenary forces to attack what it called soft targets. That means undefended civilian targets, and to avoid the Nicaraguan army, which the mercenary forces could do thanks to CIA control of Nicaraguan airspace and sophisticated communication equipment in the hands of the mercenary forces. That was officially approved by the State Department. Well, the war against Nicaragua was only one small part of Reaganite terror in Central America, which itself was only a small part of Reaganite atrocities worldwide. Remember, that's pretty much the government now in office. And the reaction illustrates another useful device of sophisticated propaganda systems. When you're caught committing, here's some advice for those of you who are going into journalism, when you're caught committing huge crimes, don't deny them. That's a mistake. That raises the issues for discussion and analysis, and then you're in trouble. What you should do is portray the actions as noble and magnificent, so shifting the grounds. Here's an example from Newsweek a couple of weeks ago. This one was brought up by FAIR media analysts. I didn't notice it. They had a prestigious columnist, international affairs columnist, Fareed Zakaria, and he lamented that the Bush administration, the current one, has been intervening in the domestic affairs of Latin America. That is, they're going back to the bad old days, he said, which came to an end when, I'm quoting, came to an end when Ronald Reagan orchestrated an extraordinary turnaround supporting human rights, democracy, and free trade. I mean, the audacity is stunning. But that's the right kind of response when you're caught as a serial killer. How noble you are. You're reinstituting human rights, and you don't even know how to answer. The audacity is stunning. After the Reagan administration broke new records in intervention in support of vicious mass murderers from Argentina all the way up to the Central American killers and torturers who practically destroyed 4 countries and reached literal genocide in the Guatemalan highlands, accompanied by fulsome praise from the saintly Reagan. There's a minor fib in his comment that has to do with free trade. In reality, Reagan doubled protectionist barriers and organized state intervention to save incompetent corporate management from Japanese competition that was wiping them out. Well, the technique is common. Harvard University has a Center for Media Studies, Shorenstein Center at the Kennedy School of Government. It's directed by a respected media leader, Marvin Cowell. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, they released a study. Cowell released a study of media coverage of the U.S.-Israeli invasion of Lebanon last summer. You really have to read it to believe it. I don't have time to go through it, but I urge it. According to Cowell's account, the United States media were pawns in the hands of Hezbollah. They covered up Hezbollah crimes, and they condemned Israel for aggression, as it was fighting a two-front existential war for its survival. I mean, the number of lies and malicious distortions per paragraph is stunning, sometimes even comical. So, for example, it includes bitter condemnation of Middle East journalism, which does not accept their high standards of objectivity and is just a propaganda instrument. I guess a proof. The proof is a London-based Arabic journal that published 22 pictures of Lebanese civilian casualties, but only one picture of Israeli casualties. Now, the actual ratio of casualties is about 25 to 1. Okay? So by objective Western standards, you have equal numbers for the aggressors and the victims, not 22 to 1, understated, as in the corrupt Arabic press. According to Cal, the wet U.S. media are almost as bad. On NBC, ABC, and CBS, 3 main channels, he writes that in the first 2 weeks of the war, there were 133 stories of Israeli attacks against Lebanon, 89 on Hezbollah attacks against Israel, which in the real world were virtually undetectable, minuscule fraction of the Israeli attacks, and furthermore were in retaliation for Israel's immediate and very heavy bombing of civilian areas in Lebanon after the capture of 2 Israeli soldiers. And the capture of 2 Israeli soldiers means demonstrably precisely nothing by Western standards. Easy to prove. For decades, Israel had been kidnapping, often killing, Lebanese and Palestinians in Lebanon or on the high seas in transit between Cyprus and Lebanon, sometimes holding them as hostages for many years. Hundreds were sent to secret prison torture chambers like Facility 1391, which is exposed in detail in Israel, reported in England on the continent, but never in the U.S. No one ever called for an invasion of Israel, and if they had, it would have been described as a reversion to Nazism. Well, this is just a tiny fraction of the pure cynicism of this. Actually, there is a response to Calv's extraordinary display of apologetics for aggression and atrocities. It's by Howard Friel. He's the co-author with Richard Falk of an outstanding book. Which came out on the coverage of Israel-Palestine by the New York Times the last 6 years. This book is a follow-up to a devastating critique of New York Times coverage of a wide range of other issues. Those are 2 more books that are far too important to review or to mention. You can search, but there were 3. Zachariah and Calb, that device, is an interesting illustration of one of the favorite maxims of John Quincy Adams, the great grand strategist of American expansionism. One of his favorite authors was Tacitus. His favorite maxim was Tacitus' statement, "Crime once exposed has no refuge but audacity." And it works in a deeply indoctrinated intellectual and moral culture. Well, let's turn to the next likely horror story. Iran. The world is aghast at the possibility of the U.S. or Israel attacking Iran. Iran's neighbors, Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, they don't like Iran. They certainly don't want to have nuclear weapons. But large majorities there, they prefer for Iran to have nuclear weapons rather than any military action. Well-known British military historian Corelli Barnett wrote a couple of weeks ago that if the U.S. attacks Iran, it'll be World War III. Iranians have been warned for years to take defensive action. Last couple of years, Israel has the largest and technologically most advanced air force anywhere, outside, greater than any NATO power outside the United States. But the U.S. for the last couple of years has been sending them about 100 advanced jet bombers. They very publicly announced, declared to be capable of bombing Iran and returning. That's a warning to the Iranians. Martin von Crefeld, leading Israeli military historian, wrote in the International Herald Tribune in Europe that, of course, he doesn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. But after the invasion of Iraq, if Iran is not developing nuclear weapons, he wrote, they're crazy. The United States informed the world that it's going to attack anyone it likes if they're defenseless. So it's an invitation to say you better build nuclear weapons. The Iranians are notified about the attack. The population here is kept in the dark. We don't know. Their information has to be kept secret because of what's called security. If you haven't done it yet, I'd advise. It's instructive to read through the record of declassified documents. We're open societies in the United States. You get a lot of declassified documents. And they're interesting reading. Now, they are kept secret for reasons of security. Security against the primary enemy, the domestic population. Overwhelmingly, they're kept. The security has to be so that the population won't know what the government's planning. I mean, there's some legitimate security, but that's the bulk of it. And this is another case. They're going to tell us what they're planning. We're not supposed to know. Maybe the attack is being planned, maybe not. Could happen by accident. The U.S. naval forces deployed in the Gulf, and it's almost like an invitation for some kind of accident. the U.S. is sponsoring terror almost certainly inside Iran. Recently it was reported from Balochistan, probably elsewhere. The likely area is Khuzestan, that's the Arab area of Iran near the Gulf, which happens to be where the oil is. You can kind of guess without seeing secret documents that some of the planning in Washington is to take over Khuzestan on the pretext of defending it from Iranian aggression. Then you got the oil, and you can carpet bomb the rest of the place. It's probably one of the plans, but we don't know. Maybe World War III. Well, is there an alternative? Yeah, there have been Iranian initiatives. In 2003, the Iranian government, with the support of the Supreme Leader Khamenei, approached the United States with an offer, which you can read. It was kept secret for years, but it's leaked. So you can read it on the internet now, so you know what it says. It called for negotiations on all nuclear issues, and also on a two-state settlement for the Israel-Palestine problem. And that continues. Khamenei, who's supreme leader, has again reiterated that Iran accepts the Arab League position on Israel-Palestine. That's a call for normalization of relations with Israel, along in terms of the long-standing international consensus on a two-state settlement that the U.S. has unilaterally blocked for 30 years and still does. The West loved Ahmadinejad. Every crazed statement of his is right on the front pages, often mistranslated. But they don't like his superior, Khamenei, who happens to be in charge of foreign affairs, so Ahmadinejad has nothing to do with it, and whose statements are just too moderate, so you don't read them. Part of the functioning of the propaganda system. Well, let's go back to these Iranian offers. Do they mean it? Well, one way to find out, and that's to explore. That's barred. The U.S. is apparently afraid that they do mean it. The 2003 offer, when it came to Washington, it did get a response. The Bush administration censured the Swiss diplomat who brought the offer and told him not to do that again. In 2004, the European Union nevertheless went ahead and did reach an agreement with Iran. Iran agreed to suspend enrichment of uranium, to which it's entitled as a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Everybody agrees on that. But they agreed to suspend it in return for the exact words, for firm guarantees on security issues. Security issues means U.S.-Israeli threats to attack Iran. Well, the U.S. would not permit the European Union to live up to its side of the bargain, would not permit them to give guarantees on the U.S. wouldn't attack. Then Iran withdrew from its side of the bargain and began enriching uranium again. Interpretation here is Iran broke the bargain. Can't trust them. In fact, the reaction has been to step up the threats. Actually, the threats are in violation of the UN Charter, if anybody cares, but that doesn't mean anything in outlaw states. The Iranian government is pretty rotten, there's no doubt about that. But we might raise the question whether there are possibilities of peaceful settlement right now, fending off possible World War III. So let's imagine, I agree, this is kind of remote, but just imagine that the United States and Iran were functioning democratic societies in which public opinion influenced policy, thought experiment. Well, actually, it's been carefully investigated by the leading institution that studies public opinion in the world, a program on international policy attitudes at the University of Maryland. You can find the results on their website. They investigated both Iranian and U.S. public opinion. It turns out that they're almost identical. In both countries, large majorities, overwhelming majorities, agree that Iran should have the right to nuclear energy, like any sign of the NPT, but that it should not have nuclear weapons. By an even larger majority, they agree that the nuclear weapon states, primarily the United States, should live up to their legal obligation, and it is a legal obligation, to eliminate nuclear weapons. 82% in the United States are in favor of that. If you can't achieve that, a very large majority, almost the same, says that the region should be nuclear weapons free. Large majorities in both countries. That includes Iran, Israel, and U.S. forces deployed there. Overwhelming agreement. In the United States, 75% of the population think that the government ought to withdraw all threats, which notice are crimes, and turn to diplomatic relations and negotiations. Well, if Iranians and Americans had any influence on the policies of the government, the crisis would probably be resolved. These are sensible outlines for the resolution of the crisis. Well, we can do a lot to make our own countries functioning democracies. For example, countries in which all of this stuff is on the front pages all the time, so people can think about it and do something about it. That would be a functioning democracy. We can't do it directly in Iran, but we can help. The best help would be to pay some attention to the dissidents, the reformers, the opposition groups, people like Shirin Ebadi, the laureate, Akbar Ganji, popular organizations, most important are the labor organizations. They're demanding an end to all threats against Iran, and for good reasons. They know, as we can all figure out ourselves, that the threats are just a gift to the hardliners. They rally support for harsh measures of repression. Now, we understand the mechanisms here. There's a threat. Everybody huddles under the umbrella of power. There's a grant for repression. That's under vastly less threat than Iran is facing. Bush's axis of evil speech in 2002 predictably led at once to attacks against the dissidents as traitors. One Iranian scholar, Columbia, Hamid Dabashi, describes the axis of evil speech as the second most severe U.S. attack on Iranian democracy. The worst attack, of course, was overthrowing the parliamentary government by force in 1953. Well, we can act to open some space for those who are seeking to overthrow the reactionary and repressive theocracy from within, instead of undermining their efforts by threats and aggressive militarism, with bipartisan support, incidentally, in the United States, although opposed by the overwhelming majority of the public in the U.S. Well, in general, the world faces quite severe dangers, and much of the problem is right here in our intellectual and our moral culture, and in the media that reflect and reinforce them. And actually, that's an optimistic conclusion. It means that we can do something about all of this if we choose.
You've been listening to the keynote speech by Noam Chomsky, delivered May 17th at the 20 Years of Propaganda Conference, organized by the University of Windsor, Canada. Due to time restrictions, 8 minutes of the audio were cut. The original speech and the Q&A that followed can be found at www.radioforall.net. Noam Chomsky's speech, The Poison Chalice, the Media, and the Use of Force, was edited for radio by CFRO 102.7 FM, Co-op Radio in Vancouver. Next week on Radio EcoShock, Cleo Wolf Erskine talks about his new book, Damnation. He's a co-founder of the Greywater Guerrillas and is currently raising awareness in North America about water issues throughout the world. It's the Water Underground Tour 2007, and you can hear it straight from the author this Sunday, June 3rd at 6 p.m. Learn and get active on water issues. Sunday, June 3rd, 6 p.m., the launch of the book Damnation at Spartacus Books, 319 West Hastings Street. And don't forget, members of Co-op Radio get a 10% discount at Spartacus Books. Just bring your membership card. Tune in next Friday for Radio EcoShock at 1 p.m. to hear Cleo Wolf Erskine on Co-op Radio 102.7 FM in Vancouver.
Professors Noam Chomsky and Kathleen Cleaver discuss race, gender, and class issues in America. They recall their activism of the 1960s and offer advice on what should be done today. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology Committee on Campus Race Relations brought them together in October for this hour and 40-minute program.
Tonight, the MIT Committee on Campus Race Relations welcomes you to the first event of a very special series that we're calling Race 2000. This series of events is intended to be both a retrospective about the racial situation in America and a clarion call for the future. Although the dawn of a new century is an arbitrary marking point, we are opting to use this opportunity to consider the ways that race, gender, class, and other related issues were addressed and are currently being addressed as we approach that date. We have entitled the event tonight as an evening of conversation because we wanted to create an event that is simple in format yet provocative, profound, inspirational in concept. Conversation. That word is often used in a casual manner, and it is rarely used to describe events of great intellectual import. In academia, we have become accustomed to attending debates, colloquia, seminars, lectures, summits, conferences, and symposia. Yet, in my opinion, none of these terms describe that most basic form of human interaction, communication, the way that the term conversation does. Tonight, we intend to explore questions that are of profound concern to us all by conversing across lines that are seldom traversed in our modern fragmented society. Race is the primary concern of the Committee on Campus Race Relations. However, we realize that it is not possible to comprehensively explore issues of race without also considering gender issues, class issues, sexuality issues, and the entire range of economic and political considerations that influence and affect the qualities of our lives. This event and the other events that will be presented in this series in the coming months is an attempt to create a program that takes into account these complexities. When I first began to tell people about this event, the most frequent question I was asked is, how did we come up with the idea to place Noam Chomsky and Kathleen Cleaver on the same program? People were quick to point out their differences. He is a white male intellectual. She is a black female activist, they said. What could they possibly have in common, I was asked. My answer then and now is that I was thinking about their similarities when we structured the program. They're both educators, both social and political activists, both intellectuals, and they have both dedicated their lives to exploring and implementing ways to bring about positive change both nationally and globally. The program this evening is designed to challenge the traditional, limiting, and in some instances restricting ways that we've been divided and kept isolated from one another. If we can even be partially successful in finding our common ground and deepening our awareness and commitment to struggling for understanding and change, we will have accomplished our purpose tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce our two guests. Professor Noam Chomsky is a graduate of Harvard University. He's been on the faculty of MIT in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics since 1955. He currently holds the position of Institute Professor. He's received numerous awards, holds several honorary degrees, and belongs to a number of professional and learned societies. Professor Chomsky has written and lectured widely on linguistics, philosophy, intellectual history, contemporary issues, international affairs, and U.S. foreign policy. While it is not possible to recount the extensive list of his published works in this introduction, it is possible for me to state my opinion that Professor Chomsky's works represent in both breadth and depth one of the most remarkable explorations of issues central to any agenda for positive social change in our history. Professor Kathleen Cleaver is currently visiting professor at Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law. She is a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, who completed these two degrees in the 1980s. Professor Cleaver's original college education was interrupted in the mid-1960s when she left school to join the civil rights movement. She initially worked full-time in the New York office of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, later moved to Atlanta to continue working with SNCC, and eventually married Eldridge Cleaver and became Communications Secretary of the Black Panther Party. She spent several years in exile in Algiers, with her family, all the while continuing to speak on and write on behalf of the Black liberation struggle. She returned to the U.S. and completed her education. After law school, she was a member of a law firm, served as a clerk in a U.S. Court of Appeals office, taught at Emory University from 1992 to 1994, and was awarded a Bunting Fellowship in 1995. In addition to her teaching duties, she is currently working on her memoir, which she's entitled Memories of Love and War. Now, just a little bit about the format. After we complete the first part of the program, which will consist of questions and conversation, there will be time for members of the audience to pose questions from the floor. Yeah, where are my questions? Okay, there we are. All right. Okay, so here's the first question. You have both led intriguing lives as radical activist intellectuals. Tell us when you got started on this path. Was there a special incident that provoked your involvement, or something in your background that prompted your activism?
I got to remember farther back, so I'll go first. Well, I was a child of the Depression. Came from a good part of my family was it was an immigrant family, first generation immigrant. Like other immigrant ethnic communities, very bound to the ethnic group, Jewish in this case. My immediate family, a lot of them were most of them, in fact, were working class people. That meant mostly unemployed. Wide range of. It was a very lively period.
I know it seems a bit lame,
and it was very intellectually alive. A lot of activism.
Just trying something a bit different.
You know, I sort of grew up in the middle of it. I don't know what to point to. I mean, I have early childhood memories of people coming to the door hungry, trying to sell rags, of traveling on streetcars with my mother and passing by strikes, textile strikes, where women were outside being beaten up by police. We have a very violent labor history in the United States, and unusual, in fact unique in the industrial world. And until the late 30s, workers were still getting murdered by private and government security forces. Meanwhile, fascism was expanding over
Hey,
Europe.
first things first.
It was very
That girl that I
frightening.
was talking about,
I could see it as a child.
I don't know what the fuck she was with.
She happened to be the only Jewish family in a
She looked like she was all over the place, and I was trying to suss her out
The
before.
immediate surroundings were scary, you know, especially the
Like, the main purpose of
black
tonight
clouds
is
in
to
the
try
background.
something a bit different.
There just was not ever much of a question. By the time I was 11 or 12, I was
Stay in the one place.
anarchist bookstores in New York, and talking to guys who had escaped from Spain during, after the fascists took over, and so it continued.
So that's what I'm doing. When I was at the beach, thirdly, sorry, when I was at the beach, it looks like Irish Day.
Radicals before I was
I'm
born.
trying to keep an
My
eye
father
out to
was
see if anything, I
working
can
on,
see anything.
something called the Texas White Primary, and it was a Democratic primary. The South was all Democrat back then, and there were activists, both black and white, in East Texas trying to put an end to the all-white primary. My mother was active in school desegregation in Virginia at the time when blacks could go to black elementary school, black high school, and black colleges.
So I'm just documenting my time.
If you wanted to go to graduate school, there was no place in Virginia. So one of her friends was a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the state of Virginia to allow blacks to attend the University of Virginia so they could go to graduate school. And the state of Virginia settled it. And instead of allowing any black person to attend the University
Next
of
time
Virginia,
I'm going to bring my
what they
charger
said is
down
that they would
into-
pay their tuition to go to any college, any graduate school in the United States that would take them. So my mother took advantage of this and went to study. She was a mathematician. She went to study at the University of Michigan, which was a much better deal, actually, than University of Virginia. And my parents met there. So she had been an activist. He was an activist. He would come up from Texas and work on his PhD in rural social development, rural sociology, something that was called community development, but that at that time, at that era, very few people knew about it. So I was born into this family, but I was also born around the time the McCarthy era was becoming very intense. And so even though my parents were active and most of their friends were activists, they never talked about it. I never heard about these things. I read about them much, much later. What I begin to remember is being a young child in Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in the 1940s and 50s, where I lived. Tuskegee Institute was 45 miles away from Montgomery, and it was a place where people who started the Montgomery bus boycott in the 1950s civil rights work would come and have meetings, and they planned to do things, and there were boycotts, and I remember going on boycotts, and I remember hearing about voter registration campaigns and lawsuits. I think Million versus Lightfoot is the suit about the gerrymander of Tuskegee. So the world in which I came conscious was an activist world challenging segregation. And then when I was 9 years old, my father stopped teaching at Tuskegee Institute. He went to work in a program that at that time was called Technical Cooperation Mission, later came to be called Agency for International Development. But he went to India in the 1950s at a time when the United States government was beginning to try in third world countries, in non-white areas, non-European areas, to persuade the government not to be friendly with communists. And one of the ways they decided to persuade the government of India, which was very independent and had just gotten out of a colonial relationship with a European power, with Britain, was to persuade them that the United States was not like their former colonial power. And how did they do this? They found black technicians to send to India to work in villages. My father was one. He took me, and I just looked and saw a beautiful, impressive world in which the entire government and the entire country was run by people of color, and they seemed to be doing quite a good job. And so it was it never occurred to me that there was any validity or any sense or any reason for whites to run everybody's lives. So I immediately became totally incompatible, improperly socialized to grow up in Alabama. I mean, where I'm living, you know, the black people run the country, the minister and the president and the prime minister. But in Alabama, where my friends are growing up, their parents, who may have graduate degrees, who have a skin color similar, they can't even vote.
Anyway, I might actually
vote,
go to
they
the
can't
base.
do anything. So immediately I know this is wrong. Now the incident that kind of triggered my involvement.
So I don't think the
later.
weirdo's
I
going to
was
come
a
out till later on in the
high
night.
school student in 1960.
Actually, fuck it, I'm going to do like now.
62, 63. And I
there's
saw on
anything
the
happening.
pages of the newspaper outside of Philadelphia in the high school that I was attending. I was at a boarding school.
Nah, fuck it, I'll go to the
My parents
base.
were living
See
in
what
Africa.
happens.
I was there. There was one black professor,
Fine.
one black student from the town, two black boarders, and a Japanese student and an African. The rest of the people were white, everybody. So I'm in this world that's very white. It was the first time in my life. I'd lived in Africa and Asia and Macon County, and you don't see too many white people in any of those places. And these girls were in the back of a paddy wagon, and they were smiling and they were singing. And the story was about the Albany, Georgia protest against the denial of the right to vote. And high school students who were getting arrested because they were protesting, and they would go to jail and they would sing. And what was so intriguing was that they were smiling. And I said, well, they look so happy. And a young woman put a sign outside the dining hall and said, we should fast in sympathy with the students from Albany who are fasting in jail. And I went on in the dining hall, didn't think about it. And the next day I came in, and there was another sign up that said, fasting is stupid. We shouldn't do that. We should find something more cooperative to do to solve this problem. And I became infuriated. Who is this student? Of course, they're all white, because I know it wasn't one of the black students who put this note up. So who is this white boy who's so protected, who has a superior attitude that he can tell young black women in Georgia who are risking their lives to change the system what they should do? So I just became infuriated. Decided I was going to find out everything about that struggle. I went to Philadelphia. I talked to activists who trained people to go down to Albany. I wrote everything down. I came back in a
Let's go to find a place to
wrote out
sit.
a two-page speech and asked if I could speak at the assembly. Our school had an assembly every Tuesday and Thursday, and I asked the art teacher, who was my friend.
At least I'm not totally wasting my
asked me what
time,
I
like
wanted to
this.
talk about.
Oh, dog. Hang on.
The assembly. and told them what this movement was about and what these students were doing and why they were doing it and why Martin Luther King was right and why nonviolence was a good thing and why they should support them. And literally, I had no idea that this would upset people. It's a Quaker school. I thought they were for nonviolent protest. That's the event that sort of got me going. And then in the same town, Tuskegee, where I was from, one of my classmates, young man I grew up with, when I was a college student here in New York, was murdered, shot in the back by a gas station attendant. My friend's name was Sammy Young. He was a student, he was a SNCC worker, he was an activist, and he was murdered after receiving lots and lots and lots of death threats, but he was murdered in an argument with a white gas station attendant over which bathroom he was going to use, the one that used to be identified for white men or the one that used to be identified for colored males, because the signs had been taken down. He was shot in the back and left at the Greyhound bus station across the street. And that incident was very personal, very painful, and I'd say 6 months later I was no longer a college student, I was a civil rights worker, I was a full-time civil rights worker, and gradually just became more and more revolutionary as the resistance against our efforts to change the society increased. Okay. What a short answer.
No, it's a good answer. What has allowed you both to maintain your momentum for so many years? And I should, all of us know that many people our age have fallen by the wayside. The politics change, you get older, you're thinking about all kinds of things, but both of you have continued on in doing the work that you do. What makes that possible?
I'm gonna sit here. The wind's not that bad.
The secret, the reason no one will tell
hopefully
you
some
is
weird
that
shit will happen.
it's joyful.
I get bored, I can just go
You
film
always
the
feel,
volleyball page.
I feel happiest when I know I'm doing something that can in some way break through and break down the kind of barriers that restrict people's ability to be creative, to be whole, to be healthy, and it makes me happy. Now it makes a lot of other people feel different things, and sometimes I've wondered, as I walk into situations where people are trying to kill me or walk into situations
It's not going to turn off for me.
it's like, oh, this might be it. I don't really feel joy then. But I will say that I talked to my father into letting me join the civil rights movement with this argument. I said, you're sitting in college.
Again, just to recap, I'm trying to sit in more than one place, rather than just constantly move around.
A semester.
So, hopefully, just pick up.
I'm not getting a good education. Give me the money, let me join the movement, and I'll really get an education. And he said, okay, I'll do it for 1 year.
See, weirdos used to hang out here at night, but it might be a bit too early for
because the movement was so collapsed.
Who knows, right?
Didn't have money to pay people's salaries, so I lived on like $100 a month. At the end of the year, he told me, your year is up. You have to go back to college. That was our deal.
I used to do...
But I'm in the middle
I
of
really
a
miss doing
revolution. I can't go back to school. And he said, well, I can't send you any more money.
Hanging out. I used to do this all the time in the
So
city.
I stayed in the revolution, and I didn't ever have a lot of money. But
City
I
has
learned more than I
definitely
ever
a
learned
lot
in my
more
life.
weirdos.
I became an entirely different
So much more
kind
weirdos,
of
especially around
very,
Century as well.
competent person with all the kinds of skills that I could potentially have developed. Each one was developed because I was forced to do things, and I enjoy learning.
But it might be a bit too early. Next time I'll come later.
And I enjoy
The only reason I really came down a bit earlier
somehow or other we can change
was to get some
this
smokes. But
culture and make a difference. That's what keeps me going.
Well, I guess we really are opposite poles in a lot of respects. I feel the same way you do with regard to the last sentence. I think there are things we can
let's
do.
take it to what's
But to
volleyball.
tell you the honest truth, if the world would go away, I can think of a lot of things I'd much rather be involved in. I particularly enjoy it. I don't like big groups. I don't like talking to big groups. I'm sorry, I apologize, but I certainly don't like to go to meetings. I hate to go to jail. I don't like debating. It's I mean, demonstrations I can't stand and so on. But, I mean, that's the honest truth. But they're just, they're just things you have to look at them, and you take a look at them. It doesn't take any imagination, All it takes is to be present to see
kayak
that
out soon as
really
well.
awful things are going on in
My
the
landlord
world.
got a
You can start
kayak.
at arm's
So I got
length.
used.
You don't have to go very far. Just take a walk downtown. It's enough. Actually, take a walk to Kendall Square and look at what's happening. People begging for food and so on. And then you can go far off to the rest of the world and find more. In fact, if you have a little imagination, you can think about what kind of a world we'll be leaving to future generations who don't have any voice. It doesn't seem to me possible to pay attention to those things, or to be alive, and not to be aware of all of that. And it doesn't seem possible to be aware of it and not to try to do something about it, even if you don't enjoy it. And mostly I don't, to tell you the truth. Although there are satisfactions, plenty of satisfactions. I mean, most worthwhile causes, I think, I assume, are going to fail. Because they're worthwhile
They all just
because
turned
they're
on.
struggles against power and authority. And the way the world works is it runs, unfortunately, mostly by force. There's people called intellectuals who try to explain that in their own
It's actually
country
kind of
and
relaxed.
institutions it isn't like that. But it's just not true.
Really
And that means
relaxing,
that most things
actually.
that are worth doing are going to involve a large measure of failure, sometimes disastrous failure, because you're running up against powerful and brutal forces. Sometimes there's a degree of success, and over a long period I think you can see general progress. And some of the activities have, you can see specific progress, even particular people that are helped, and groups that are helped, and so on. But it's small successes, hard work. I don't particularly find it, it wouldn't be my first choice if I was just thinking how to, sort of be happy. I'd much rather be in my study working, to tell you the truth. There's no choice as far as I can see. There's no choice if you want to be able to look yourself
I am
in the
trying to
mirror.
settle down as I'm doing things like this, but trying to take a different approach. Because I
Variously
technically
defined
got no
as
time
the 60s, the
restrictions.
70s, or the revolution, or the counterculture.
Next time I have to bring my
that 30 years that followed the end of World
my
War
phone
II has
charger,
taken on
so
wicked proportions. Nowadays,
see the
books, films,
yeah,
TV
'cause I'm
production,
on
and
40%
popular
at the
culture
moment,
have
but
revived interest in that era's movements, fashions, music, and politics. What stands out to you as significant about that time?
so it's got the urge just to get up
I
and
think
go
the
again.
most
So
significant things about that period, many
you
of them
might
are
walk
written
down
by
the
people
street.
who were
The end, in
most
fact,
greatly
Queen's different bad,
inspired
but
and organized a very significant counterattack, which we've been living with ever since, to destroy everything that was achieved then. And they're pretty articulate and reasonably intelligent. And some of them have published things you really ought to read. Everybody ought to read. I was teaching undergraduate courses here for about 25 years on political topics, off on my own time, a lot of fun. But one thing we always had students read was, after it simply came out, was a book called The Crisis of Democracy, which was the first publication of the Trilateral Commission. It was published in 1975. The Trilateral Commission was founded by David Rockefeller, and it brought together Trilateral because it brought together elite elements from the three, what's called the triad, Japan, the United States, and Europe, three rich areas. These were mostly liberal elites, incidentally. It's the group of people who were around the Carter administration. In fact, the Carter administration was drawn entirely from that group, including Carter, so it gives you roughly their political complexion. They were scared to death by what happened in the 60s. The Crisis of Democracy, and they're very frank about it. It was not meant to be read. It was, in fact, as soon as people started reading it, it went off the market. But it was meant to be sort of an internal discussion among sort of smart guys. The American rapporteur was from big professor at Harvard. What terrified them, and they're very frank about it because it's basically an internal document, is the fact that during the 1960s, great masses of people who are ordinarily apathetic and obedient and do what they're told and don't get anybody's hair and so on, became organized and politicized and started to think for themselves and find their own ways of living, challenge authority, or put forth their demands in the political arena that really drove them up the wall. That's the crisis of democracy. The institutions were no longer working anymore. In fact, what they called the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, meaning universities, schools, churches, and so on. The universities that were responsible for the indoctrination of the young were not doing their job. The young were getting out of control. They were, challenging authority. They were getting interested in crazy stuff like truth and justice and freedom and all that kind of business, and actually trying to do something about it. And what's more, they were really changing the country. I mean, the country really changed. It's a very different and much more civilized country than it used to be in the early 1960s in many, many respects. And this was extremely frightening to elite groups, including liberal elites, and their proposals were to try to find ways to beat back this challenge, to try to, as the American Harvard professor put it, to restore the good old days. He described with a little bit of exaggeration. He said back in the days of the Truman years, Truman was able to govern the country with the help of a few Wall Street lawyers and financiers. Sorry for the attack on lawyers. So in those days, few Wall Street lawyers and bankers or something like that could run the country, but in the 60s, this was all getting out of control. I mean, all this rabble is getting around, this mass of people who aren't supposed to be doing anything, they're just supposed to be following orders. Now we have to restore indoctrination and passivity and apathy. And there's been, in fact, from that time, a major doctrinal attack against an assault on the universities, and a very strong effort to narrow even further the rather narrow spectrum of kind of respectable expression, media, and so on. At the same time, there's been a struggle against it. But what they were pointing to is quite real. I mean, all of those things were happening. They happened in a very exciting way. They happened. It was mostly young people. There had been the same attack. This is a cycle
really
that we keep going through in American history. So the 1920s were an extremely apathetic period. In fact, the labor movement was totally smashed, mostly by violence at that time. And the place looked like the end of history. Everybody was talking about wonderful, it's all over, everybody follows orders,
it was worth giving it another place. It was worth giving it just
it was a period of active,
try to stay in one place at a time.
All fronts really changed things.
I realize I haven't had anything to eat. I've released a new movie today.
There was something like, there was a major assault on it. That's the
so I'm just going to go home. Something new way of doing filming instead of just moving around. I know I'm moving around at the moment, but
McCarthy was a latecomer.
I thought I'd try to stay in one space, one spot for a few minutes at a time.
Going on, again, often led by liberal elites.
Next time I film around Manly Wharf.
Much more destructive. And the 50s became very quiet and apathetic, not as bad.
Trying to slow down my
pretty bad. And again, there are a lot of predictions. It's all over. Everything's in order. Nobody's going to bother us anymore. Then the 60s came along, blew it out of the water, terrified the same groups. Assault starts over again. We beat back the crisis of democracy. We're living in the middle of that reaction now. The things that they were worried about were real and important, and they made the country more free, more just, more honest. They changed styles. I mean, that takes MIT. Back in 1960, nobody would be dressed like this. I was wearing a jacket and a tie, and students were respectful, and I didn't say respectable, and those things are not just.
So I'm in my car at the moment. So I'm trying to practice just to recap, just as practice.
It was like
trying to stay a bit more present as I'm filming, a bit more caught in the one place.
These changes from
just to see what happens. It's my first time doing it, so I'm a bit
respect for other cultures, to concern for rights. All of these things were perfectly real.
So I know I wasn't talking much on it, but
they've resisted the attack.
So, but anyway, I'm hungry. I put out a new movie today too, which I should go home and do some promotions
what were the 60s about? Yeah, I think
exactly. And I don't know if I'll vlog more, but
that's what the 60s were about.
But
I grew up in the 60s. I went to high school.
I'll go home and I'll have something to eat first, then chill out a bit.
I got married in 1967.
It's a new practicing style. I might do it a few more times to see how it goes.
From 15 to 25, that's that.
Next time I'll hopefully bring my phone charger as well. That took maybe about 6 gigabytes.
My sense of it is quite different in the sense that
I might sit a bit more close to the wall.
Actually, I thought I was in the
that
baby boomer until I read some magazines.
Yeah, the wind and stuff seems a bit more, not as much.
So I guess I'm not quite a baby boomer, but
new way of filming, just to see if it's also staying put, to see if any weirdos and stuff come out.
About the same age.
It's just a new way to kind of do vlogging as well for me as well.
At the same time.
But since I haven't been talking as much,
that had never happened before, and that's true of blacks.
I don't know. I've just been just doing things existing, so it would be good to be a bit more grass.
Is significant. Is what I will refer to as the student
anyway,
movement.
I think I just need to break more. So I'll do a little bit more vlogging when I get home and stuff.
Very powerful and very diffuse thing, because the student population was the largest cohort that had ever been in college in the United States. So you have movements of students in black colleges, for example, who are challenging the extraordinarily authoritarian structure of that college. You had students at white universities who were challenging the authoritarian structure of their college after having been participants, let's say, in a civil rights summer led by students who had joined the Civil Rights Movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or some other group. The student movement was the base out of which the anti-war movement, that was the mass movement, there was anti-war movements and pacifist movements in this country from quite some time ago, but the mass movement of anti-war protest came out of the student movement. And the women's movement came out of the student movement. All the women who were involved in what became women's movement or women's liberation were women who were just as educated as these men who were in the same organizations they were in, and the men were always taking leadership positions and the women were taking notes. And some of the women began to say, well, why do I have to listen to you? My education is just as good. And the women's movement upset quite a bit of the emotional stability of men in the radical movement. I think it was Todd Gitlin who wrote that era of the late 60s and early 70s was, he said it was exhilarating for women and very horrible for men, or something like that. And I couldn't quite figure out what his problem was until I realized that he was one of the men who was in a position of leadership in an organization that was working along old rules, even though it was supposed to be New Left. So the thing, though, to me that stands out as significant, as the most significant, as if this did not happen, we would not have that era called the 60s or the 70s. We would not have the explosion of imaginative music and literature and theater. The thing that triggered it for me was the Vietnam War. On the one hand, that's an foreign event, but it has so many profound internal consequences for the United States, which I will start in 1954. I mean, that's at the point in which the French are defeated in Indochina, and America begins to take on a military and political role of sustaining a different type of government in Vietnam and supporting the anti-communists. And the reason I picked that date, 1954, is because the other very significant thing was the Brown decision by the United States Supreme Court that was also handed down in 1954, taking the position for the first time in 105 years, I believe, since Plessy. The Plessy decision says
anyway, if you're watching this, thanks for watching.
Separate but equal facilities for racial lines. guidelines are constitutional. The Brown decision says segregation in education is unconstitutional. And the way that was interpreted in black communities was with exuberance and exhilaration, as the Supreme Court has said segregation is unconstitutional. It is said in education, but it was interpreted, and the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement, leaped. I mean, from that day, from the May 19th, or what date that decision was made, the movement took off. And so those two events interacting within the context of the United States gave it a dynamic, gave it a sense of purpose, a sense of possibility, also a sense of horror. I was in a movement that was very internationalist, looked at liberation struggles in Africa, liberation struggles in Asia, in China, in Cuba, and continually said if the Vietnamese can win their independence from the United States, if they can fight against the most powerful military behemoth in the world, so can we. And so that dynamic and that kind of willingness to risk your life and put everything on the line to change, that the Vietnam War allowed, I think, significantly altered all the other possible struggles, and it generated such internal dissension and protest among whites that the whole cultural hierarchy fell apart and has been put back together, but it's not the same.
Thank you.
That was pretty good Irish things.
What happened? Why did
try to take the same method as before.
That's sort of the question.
Sit down here.
What happened to the 60s? And I always say
any weirdness happens, which I doubt it.
And also, I've been students have said to me, "Why did you all give up?" And I've often said that I don't think the movement stopped voluntarily. And so I want to ask the question about the government's COINTELPRO, we call it COINTELPRO, but it's counterintelligence program that was directed at that era and the individuals who were operating in that era and the groups that were most active in that era, and ask each of you, how did the COINTELPRO program, and you can of course elaborate on it a little bit more and explain it a little bit more than I have right now, how did that program affect both of you?
Well, first of all, the idea that this, let me just start with the kind of presupposition. The idea that the 60s came to an end is completely wrong. I mean, if you think of the movements, I was saying that the idea that the 60s movements ended is completely false. In fact, that's propaganda. It's part of the propaganda that is trying, and so far failing, to get people back to passivity and obedience. If you just think back, I mean, some of you too young to remember, but you know anyway. If you think of the movements that have really had a major effect on American life and culture and society, and the way we act with one another, and so on and so forth, they're movements of the 70s, not of the 60s. The feminist movement, as Kathleen said, that's a movement of the 70s, and that's probably had maybe a broader effect on the whole culture than anything else I can think of.
I've only seen one patrol
of the 70s, barely nothing existed in the 60s.
An Aboriginal girl here too.
And that's there's a kind of a deep moral thrust behind that. It's saying we care about the world that's going to exist in the future, not just for ourselves, but what it means for other people. People who don't have a vote in the marketplace, if you want to use that ridiculous idiom. One of the many respects in which it's a grotesque system. But the solidarity, I mean, let's take even the anti-war movement, the Vietnam anti-war movement. It was a very important thing. I mean, I spent a lot of time, and effort, and suffering, and so on in it.
I'm going to check out Manly War if I can.
Was pretty close to going to jail for a long time, in fact, just by a miracle. But despite all that, let me just tell you that the Vietnam War movement, anti-war movement, was very small as compared with the solidarity movements of the 1980s. So, for example, in the 1960s, nobody dreamed of going to live in a Vietnamese village in the hope that a white face might limit the violence of the state terrorists that the U.S. was organizing, or U.S. forces themselves. could have, it might well have limited the
No
violence.
seagulls
It's not an
aren't
idea that
to
even
be
occurred
seen.
to anyone. Well, thousands of people did that in the 1980s.
Not around at all.
Not people from the left, particularly. A lot of them were coming from, Midwestern Christian
So fucking
fundamentalist
weird.
groups. But there was just a sense
There's a lot
that
more drunks out
the
tonight
United
than
States was carrying out a violent terrorist
previous
war in the 1980s, mainly targeting the church, in fact. The church, popular organizations,
fun.
and so on. That's part of the attack on the crisis of democracy had spread to Central America. And there you do it a little more harshly.
I'm going to walk up to SeaWorld and turn around.
And it was very brutal. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. It was monstrous and so on.
So I've had a
lot
thought.
worse
I think I'm a
if
bit
the
more lost
opposition
for
to it
time,
had
a little
been
bit.
only at the level of the 60s. They could never
Of not
send
going to meetings,
B-52s.
commuting to meetings and
They
all
had
that
to
sort of
organize
stuff.
an international terror network instead of sending
And I've just been
U.S.
finding it hard to
military
sit
forces
still a
directly.
bit. So,
And it was because of the turmoil and the ferment and the literal participation. I mean, there were tens of thousands of people from
so
here
tomorrow
who
night,
went down to see
tomorrow I got to
what
be at the
was
mate.
going
I
on
got
and
to be
share the
working
lives of the
tomorrow.
people, maybe protect them, help, and so
Going
on.
home,
Nothing like that was
shower
even
and shit.
conceivable in the 1960s.
clean myself up.
The difference is quite dramatic.
Hopefully get to do a meeting
the,
as well.
So these movements lasted. Not only
Then
lasted, but they grew
hopefully
and
get
they
some writing
expanded
done as
and they
well.
continued and still going on. In the at the peak of the anti-war movement, say
Maybe too much energy as well.
1965,
So I don't know why I kind of got up and
conceivably
came back here
had a
again
group
specifically.
not
But I
only
was
like
going to
this. You couldn't have filled a classroom at MIT.
I got all the jobs
with
done
people
earlier
interested in these things.
that I thought I
I'll
finished
tell you
up the
from
script
experience.
that I did.
When we were trying to have meetings
I
against
didn't
the
film
Vietnam
early
War
as long
at
as I
places
thought I
like
would
MIT
be,
and
but
Harvard, incidentally, in the mid-60s.
so maybe that's
we would
because
put
the resume
together
came
half a
back.
dozen
But,
issues. The Vietnam
you
War,
know,
Vietnam, Venezuela.
so I'm going to have another waddle
Iran,
through.
The price of bread. I mean, maybe figure if you get
It's really weird.
10 issues,
Everyone's more
you
drunk
might
than
be
they
able
were
to get
before.
20 people to come out
So,
and maybe listen. I mean, when I started
Fucking
giving
hilarious.
talks, there were literally I give a talk in a church.
Hilarious.
There were 4 people there.
Anyway, no one's
the
here to
guy who
talk to
organized
anyway,
it,
so
some guy
Wanna
was out in the
go?
streets and it was cold, and 2 people who wanted to kill you. That's in fact, Boston's a pretty liberal city.
So-
But as late as mid
feeling
1966,
like a fucking gypsy
that's when
at
there
the
were
moment.
hundreds of thousands of American troops in Vietnam, and the country
Yeah,
was
look, the
virtually
ferry's going.
devastated. Killed hundreds of
No,
thousands
just in
of
the
people.
background, that's the ferry.
And at that time, we could not have a public meeting against the war in Boston.
Right.
You couldn't have a meeting at the Boston Common or at the Arlington
So I don't know
Street
what I
Church,
got out of that.
even in a church.
I knew I
because
wanted
it would
to film
simply be
tonight,
attacked by
but-
counter-demonstrators, violently attacked by
My
counter-demonstrators,
next set
many
of
of them
film's going to
students,
be fucking
incidentally,
Sunday. So.
marching over from the colleges to destroy it, with the applause of the press, including the liberal press. That's what the world was like at the peak of the Vietnam War.
Fuck,
It
that little
changed
trip
dramatically,
from
and a lot of it changed because of
where
the
I just
events of
walked
the 70s
to
and the 80s.
now,
These
Manly
things
Wharf just
remained.
seems so
They
much more
fall
quieter
off
now.
The attempts at repression, they've been growing. The belief that it's
Fucking
collapsed
lots
is
of-
simply false. Anybody thinks about what's
Ooh.
happened knows that's not true. Well, that's
Start of a
not
horror
in the
movie.
first sentence. On COINTELPRO,
Sorry.
But that actually is.
I've got to walk
what
back
you're
down
saying
the
is a
course anyway.
COINTELPRO.
Well, COINTELPRO, right? COINTELPRO is a very significant thing, and you should, again, if you don't know about it, you should learn about it. It's 1,000 times more significant than, say, Watergate. I mentioned Watergate because the expose of COINTELPRO and of Watergate was just about exactly at the same time. In comparison to COINTELPRO, Watergate was a tea party. The only reason why anybody pays attention to Watergate is the targets were rich, powerful
So I'm
people.
kind of in the area where I
And
normally
rich,
get
powerful
coffee
people
at.
fight back. Like the...
It's actually pretty fucking tame. I just saw some guy getting arrested too.
The CEO of IBM
So,
and those guys, or the
I was
Democratic
walking
Party, which
from
is
the
after all
wharf
half
towards
of
the
the
Corso.
power in the country.
There's
You
people in
follow
front of me,
them
I'm trying to
and
ignore.
get ready. They're powerful and rich, and
And
that's
just-
considered a scandal. To go
I
after,
think she sounded Italian or Spanish. I started yelling at some dude.
Nothing, incidentally, happened at Watergate. For example, everybody was totally scandalized by Nixon's
hell.
enemies list. Pages, all that. I mean, I was on Nixon's enemies list. They never even audited my income tax. I mean, it's a meaningless, totally meaningless thing. But the point is, rich, powerful, not me, of course, but, rich, powerful people were on Nixon's enemies list. So it was a scandal. I mean, the break-in of the Democratic Party headquarters.
The pub area is crazy.
There was a couple of sort of crooks who were gathered together for some unknown purpose who did nothing. I mean, but it became a huge scandal because they were powerful people they were attacking. Let's turn to COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO, which was revealed at the same time. At the same time, not very little in the press or anywhere else. It came out in the courts. Freedom of Information Act, mostly courts just released documents. Well, it turns out that for
I saw another
the
couple
Eisenhower administration and right up till Nixon, the government had been the government. It's not a little group of people put together by Nixon when he was drunk or something, but the federal government through 4 administrations were running a terrorist program against dissent. Literally a terrorist program, major terrorist program. I mean, it started.
Here's where
Party
the coffee
under Kennedy it really took off.
I gotta get coffee.
Puerto Rican nationalists
And some or most ones are kind of
what they called black nationalists.
Try to stay put one
target.
place.
Panthers in particular were devastated by it. The women's movement as a whole was attacked as soon as it began to come into existence. The New Left across the board. In fact, there was virtually nothing that was left out. Maybe the Panthers.
So anyway, as I was saying, I could have started to be a bit more settled.
We now know a lot from released documents.
Always over the place, which is a constant threat that I have against me.
But they were devoting enormous efforts to destroy the party.
So I got to follow
doing
through.
things like running free breakfast programs in churches and things like that. And it reached the level of outright political assassination. The literal Gestapo-style political assassination. The person.
But I know kind of subconsciously what I'm trying to get at.
In the COINTELPRO records was the assassination of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton, who's an organizer in the Chicago ghettos. They were not going after him because he was a criminal or anything else. He was anything but. He was a very effective organizer. That's the kind of guy they want to kill. FBI tried to get a criminal gang in the ghetto, Blackstone Rangers.
You know, this is just
the Rangers to kill him by
I think I had to learn how to be a bit more disconnected
letters.
from the world.
You read the letters. They're so
it's the one.
They remember those letters, did you? I don't know how they could imagine that anybody would believe they were, got some FBI agent putting on black dialect or something, dear brothers. It was kind of like, if it hadn't been so awful, it would have been a comic strip. But the idea was to try to get the Rangers to believe that the Panthers had a contract out to kill their leaders, and then they'd go kill them. Well, that didn't work, so they just took it over directly. It was a combined operation of the FBI and the Chicago police, which simply went in and murdered him at 4 o'clock in the morning, probably drugged, killed a couple other people.
Trying to figure out what to do with this balloon.
There was an attempt to cover it up, but couldn't keep, came out in the courts, and there's no doubt about what happened. In comparison with this, what's wrong?
So maybe I'll leave it on somebody's doorstep.
One of the minor elements of COINTELPRO, really minor.
Oh, fuck, I'm going to be all over the place.
A political party. A political party which is every bit as legitimate as the Democratic Party, Socialist Workers' Party. All the rights of the Democratic Party. Right? Only one difference between the Socialist Party and the Democratic Socialist Workers' Party and the
I don't want to run off.
Socialist Workers'
Party.
I
got a healthy
powerless
so I don't want to do that.
The Democratic Party is half the
It's
wealth
not getting
in the
things done. Now,
well, in the case of the Socialist Workers' Party, they didn't send in some Keystone Cops to steal some documents for no known reason. They went, the FBI, which is the National Political Police, went after them and tried to destroy them. They robbed their offices, they stole their records, they tried to get employers to blacklist their members. They tried to destroy the party. Infinitely worse than anything that happened to the Democrats. Anybody care? No? Does anybody know about COINTELPRO and as compared with Watergate? No, and it tells you something about the elite culture that we're all trained in and brought up in when we get our degrees at Harvard and so on. What matters is if you do things to people with power. That's bad. If you do infinitely worse things,
what happens when you don't have a social life as well?
Merit a footnote in history. And you just look at the coverage of these two events which came out at the same time, and it makes it very clear. Incidentally, MIT was also targeted by COINTELPRO. This is pretty minor, I should say, as compared with the things that Kathleen can tell you about or that I just mentioned. It's nothing, but the FBI did try to disrupt courses at MIT, mine. Incidentally, whether any of this stuff ever happened, I don't know, but it's in the FBI records. The government was required under court order around 1980, I guess, to release documents to people who were targeted by illegal COINTELPRO activities. Not bad illegal, because they're all radically illegal. So in the course of that, we got some documents. Louis Kempf, who many of you know, and I were teaching the courses I think I mentioned for many years here. And they tried to disrupt them. We had a lot of students, and there were assistants, and some of the assistants were people who had been active in the civil rights movement and the student movement and so on. The first document, a set of documents, first one comes from the Boston FBI office to J. Edgar Hoover in Washington, saying, "Our source within MIT." Zero idea who a black line. We spent a lot of time trying to decipher. But our source, if you've ever looked at these documents, they're half blacked out. Our source within MIT tells us that these assistants, these bad guys are teaching in this course. This is a good opportunity for a disinformation effort to try to undermine it and to get rid of them and so on and so forth. Disrupt the course and so on. They need authorization from Washington. They get authorization from Washington. And then it goes up and back for a lot of boring communications.
So Monday,
and the last one says our source within MIT
when I get to see my boss
tells us that our operation was.
I'm going to speak to her about gaining more hours on 3 days rather than spreading them out over 4 days.
Well, that is such a tiny footnote to COINTELPRO. I'm embarrassed even to mention it. I do because it's close to home. But this was it's a major project. Theoretically, it was ended when it was exposed. I don't see any reason to believe that it was ended. But it's because it's just not. Maybe going on under some other name or something. Well, that's COINTELPRO. It was no joke. People were killed. The worst case was the Hampton assassination. Lives were destroyed. And it was a major attack on dissent, any kind of dissent, across the board by the end. And it had its effects. It certainly disrupted and harmed plenty of people, killed some. I think in the case of the Panthers, it probably destroyed them. It's one thing for rich white folks like us to, say, okay, you laugh at it when they do this stuff to us. It's quite different if you're a poor, defenseless person in the ghetto. Very different. It had its effects, but to say that it ruined the movement is just not. It did ruin a lot of things. It may have very seriously harmed the black movement. But other things continued and, in fact, grew and expanded, and they can continue to.
Well, I'll talk a little bit about what COINTELPRO was, only in terms of the FBI, but the concept of counterintelligence was much broader than the FBI. We focused in on the FBI because they were the most visible, and the things they did were the closest to us. But, for example, let's take a city like Los Angeles. There's the FBI racial squad that's operating to get rid of black radicals and revolutionaries, and they focus in on the Black Panthers. In the Los Angeles Police Department, there is the criminal conspiracy squad, and their focus is to get rid of black radicals, in particular Black Panthers. So they work together. And in the Central Intelligence Agency, they have their own particular units doing the same thing. In the Department of Defense Intelligence, they have their units doing things. In the National Security Agency, they have their units doing the same thing. And so what we didn't know, we said, yes, it was a police state and they were out to get us. But what we had no idea was the amount of agencies and the amount of money and the amount of technology that was used to destroy us. But just look at one particular individual, a young man named Elmer Geronimo Pratt, who was discharged from the United States Army in, I think, about 1968. Took his GI Bill, went to UCLA as in a program called High Potential to get a college degree. I think I might have to say something about Boston. He met another Black Panther named Prentice Bunchy Carter in that program. Carter recruited him into the Black Panther Party, and within
here's somebody's backyard.
Within 7 months,
Prentice
Carter was murdered
anyway,
on the UCLA campus after a black student meeting.
If I didn't have other things to do in my personal life, I'd
Carter
probably give
and
it
John
more to
Hutchins
work.
were murdered on the
I like
UCLA
working, but
campus after
I'd
a
rather work
black
for my own shit.
student
So.
meeting to discuss who was going to run the African American, I think at that time they called it Black Studies program. The university had picked someone named Ron Karenga. The students felt that
I need a break from Manly, so I'm not going to do the Manly meeting
and
at
invited
5.
a couple of Panthers to this meeting. Bunchy Carter
one
told all
Harvard
the
at 7.
Panthers before they came to the meeting, look, we're not in any kind of conflict with Karenga. We don't have anything against him.
Why not? It's
We're
only
only
3
going there
hours,
because the
so.
students ask us, and no one should bring any weapons. So this is a very calm, unexciting student meeting, at the end of which an
it might be a
incident
good
is
meeting.
provoked by someone in us saying something to a woman named Elaine Brown who had ties with the Black Panther Party. She says something to John Huggins. Gunfire ensues. 2 Panthers are dead. The FBI agent who wrote about it, a man named Wes Swearingen, who has subsequently revealed a lot of his
fuck, you know what I've
information in the
done?
book
You know
called
what I keep
FBI
forgetting
Secrets,
to do
says
is
the agents came back, the 2
convert a
FBI
video
agents plus
file
the
that
2
I've been
blacks
needing
in
to
the US
convert.
organization who were there
I keep forgetting
infiltrators
to
came
convert it.
back upset, saying that wasn't supposed to happen. There wasn't supposed
Why
to
would
be
I
any
bust
shooting
my
on the
makeup?
campus, and the reason why? They weren't supposed to be killed on the campus because some white students might have been
Everything's
killed in the gunfire.
Anyway,
they were supposed to have
keep
been
going.
killed, but somewhere else.
Life goes
so
on,
that's just
so
one little January
you can either be an
1969
emotionally
incident, an
fucked up
example
person
of
like most of us are,
counterintelligence work within
or you
the
just
Black
keep
Panther
going.
Party, against the Black Panther Party, and the purpose was not only to kill the leadership of a particular branch, it was very powerful, but to also instigate conflict